Hello and welcome to video 3 in my series on leftism and climate change. My name is Max Reynolds. I'm the author of The Revolutionary Renaissance, a study on the dialectical evolution of totalitarian thought. And you can find more of my work at my website, maxoreynolds.com. In the last lecture, we began with some of the ideas of René Descartes and his philosophy, specifically exploring the mind-body dualism, which is characteristic of his ideas. And we also looked at how Canguilhem would go on and essentially argue against this, stating that the metaphysical position that Descartes had taken, making the appeal to God, the rationalism, the deduction down from God, and the soul and the role of the soul in human life were essentially forms of errors which were characteristic of Descartes' time. Descartes didn't have the models that we have today. So Canguilhem is going back and finding an alternative means of critiquing one of the key figures in early Western philosophy, and then using this to reinvigorate and find a different route to both dialectical reason, historicist methodology, and undoing some of Descartes' ideas in order to replace them with a biologically rooted form of materialism. So, in line with this, Canguilhem establishes the root of ideas. The form and content is nature itself, so it's this circular linking with nature, but with principles the organisms can be self-organizing. They're also influenced by their wider environment. They can develop tools to affect their environment, which likewise acts back on themselves indirectly through the mediation of the environment, you can say. And he also developed ideas about the history of science and scientific ideology. So this was coming up with a theory in philosophy, and then you test the theory in philosophy, so that's the scientific stage, at which point the theory is relegated to being a scientific ideology. It's shown to just be some old kind of model, and you've replaced it with a new model, so it's this iterative process of transformation. And lastly, his assault on analytic forms of reason and Western philosophy and the non-materialist ways of thinking and conceiving the world involves the integration of subjective sense of meaning into whether it's philosophy, science, or whatever kind of particular practice you're taking part in. And this allows him to integrate the moral aspects into philosophy. And of course, we're going to see the more kind of neo-Marxist sides of morals and things being integrated into philosophical investigation inquiry, including the methods. So number 3, we're going to take a sidestep to Jean-Paul Sartre, who is instead a literary figure. So he's quite different in terms of training from Georges Canguilhem, but we'll recognize that Jean-Paul Sartre was writing at a very similar time to Canguilhem. So these, typically from 40s, 50s, and certainly the 60s. Sartre was a peer to Canguilhem. I believe they taught at the same École Supérieure in France, in Paris. So they would have been aware of one another's work and certainly would have crossed paths and influenced with one another. And you can certainly see in some of Sartre's writing a bit of a Canguilhemian influence in terms of the way that you're conceptualizing of a milieu and the kind of milieu which can affect an organism. Here we're starting to see the transformation of some of Canguilhem's ideas into a more kind of person-centered orientation rather than just an organism and environment type orientation. So there's a couple key ideas with Jean-Paul Sartre. He is a big champion of dialectical form of reason and of lived experience of the dialectical form of reason. So we'll be exploring these two ideas. Sartre was likewise trained in the Marxist tradition, so he has access to the methodology in terms of subject-object collapse and the dialectical means of associating ideas through reflection and transforming them through mediation. And he also has access to the historicist idea of progressing towards a monad at the end of history, which was, of course, in Marxism. So Sartre is a very useful figure because he is more focused on the literature by training, although he obviously has a mastery of the dialectical form of philosophy. But the literature aspect allows him to express himself in a more fluid, adaptable, and wide range of fashion, which you don't necessarily find in the other philosophers and thinkers. Canguilhem obviously approaching from a very scientific background. Marx, coming from a very Hegelian perspective, whereas Sartre is influenced by obviously Marx and Hegel, and to a degree Canguilhem as well. You can see that come through in his work, but the literature aspect allows Sartre a lot more freedom to talk around the subjective experience of certain events and ideas, and this will heavily influence some of the conceptions he comes out with, and also the people he later influences, like Paulo Freire. So Sartre worked with Canguilhem at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. So other key figures went to that same university. We got people like Althusser, who came up with a de-Hegelianized form of Marxism. So that's an explicit recapitulation of the original revolutionary project. And then you later have figures like Foucault and Derrida also attending the same institution. So this is the creme de la creme when it comes to the Marxist institutions in France. It's where the best people go. Sartre is of the same generation as Bataille, Lyotard, and Lacan. So these are all, quite big heavy hitters, influencing some of the changes that take place in neo-Marxism. And Sartre was certainly committed to continuing the Marxist project. In fact, he said that he wanted to reconquer man with Marxism, and stated that every anti-communist is a dog, and that was in Revel, Last Exit to Utopia. And elsewhere, in his literary essays, which is what we're going to begin looking at as well, he calls for a return of the revolution. So he's very conscious of the fact that the position of Marxist philosophy and revolutionaries at the moment, if you're considering that we're in the 1950s, is largely failure in terms of the international revolution. It hasn't materialized, and where it has materialized, it's manifested itself in an extremely violent fashion. Of course, when it comes to considering that anyone who disagrees with you is a dog, then that's not really much of an issue for Sartre. And we'll certainly see that he comes up with other ideas such as revolutionary violence. He wants Marxists to reinterpret this, so, to change the meaning of the word, so that whenever violence is used, it's always in self-defense. So this is the idea of the victimhood of the revolutionaries. So even if they do something which is on the aggressive, it should be framed as defense. So these are the rhetorical and the linguistic games. You start to see them emerge in Sartre. We'll see them heavily influence Derrida and Foucault. So you can really see that literature aspect come through from Sartre, also with influences from Horkheimer and Adorno, since they have the same kind of thesis of division of labour and language, and that the scientific language is inherently oppressive against poetic. So there's a complementary kind of movement between Horkheimer and Adorno and Sartre if you're looking for some other resources. Now, in What is Literature, Sartre says that surrealism had been united with Marxism but was moving beyond it. And this is going to be quite an important idea when we go forward through the rest of his works. Surrealism is obviously the kind of the antipode of whatever it is that you're if you went outside, cars don't drive on their roof or bounce and hop along like pogo sticks, but that might be something you would see in a surrealist piece of art or a surrealist piece of filmography. And it's that kind of approach which is being now applied to the existing society, its culture, its form of reason. So you tie it to the surrealism, show that it's A, surreal, or B is just nothing at all, and then you replace it with a new dialectical alternative. You specifically see that thesis come through very strongly in Derrida. It underpins his system of deconstruction, but it ultimately has its roots in Marx, if you go back to his Epicurean books on Epicurean philosophy. So the important thing to recognise is that Marx was waging theological warfare against Christ and Christianity. The entire system, very much beginning with Hegel and his making God derivative of man, is taken up very explicitly by Feuerbach. Feuerbach seeks to get rid of necessarily some of the philosophical trappings, and then reintegrate the divine aspect, or this divine idea, back into collective humanity. So you've already got the idea of religious human collective, and that the collective is one and the same as God in Feuerbach, so that's prior to Marx. In Marx, you then see this in a more kind of totalizing way to prevent any contradictions, at least in thought and in the way that we view the world. So this is where you end up with humanity as the collective, but also with nature, and then specifically through the materialist lens, and that's the deity that's in Marx's system, is humanity conjoined with nature through the materialist methodology, which obviously necessitates the use of the dialectical methodology, historicism, and that human nature is constantly reformed by humanity in nature as it so wills. So that's the socialist construction aspect. Even if you've implemented communism, which is the abolition of private property, you still have the ability to constantly reform and reshape human nature and the consciousness of the divine. So that's the socialism. So what we'll see in Marx is, quote, "The criticism is therefore fully justified in forcing the state that relies on the Bible into a mental derangement in which it no longer knows whether it is an illusion or a reality, and in which the infamy of its secular claims, for which religion serves as a cloak, comes into insoluble conflict with the sincerity of its religious consciousness, for which religion appears as the aim of the world." So this statement's really useful for essentially kind of parsing out some of the ideas of surrealism, which are already latent within Marx's thought. And it's this idea that if you're taking atheism, then ultimately, at least from the perspective of Feuerbach, the argument is that humans create the idea of God. So God is a derivative of the human. Now, this can take place without people being conscious of it, and this is obviously manifesting itself, as far as Marx is concerned, as alienation. So the belief in God is a form of alienation, because in reality it's just humanity that's the origin. So human understanding and thought has been mediated with this idea of God, but instead of going out into this idea and then being reflected back in, now we need to move beyond that stage with greater philosophical understanding and development. So given that this is a psychological projection as far as Feuerbach and Marx are concerned, and that it's a psychological projection which divorces humanity from the fundamental part of its essence, which is the union of humanity and nature, and that's the divine being, it's essentially a form of deceit and delusion, or delusion if it happens unconsciously, but deceit when it's imposed and encouraged. And so coming to this realization, you need to flip it, you need to undo it. And so there's the moral justification that given this state of affairs of the projection of God and everything associated therewith, you can drive any state and people who are based on those ideas into a mental derangement. So the idea is to associate them with the things that are false. So God is actually just a vacuum, it's a nothing, it's a non-entity. And as far as Marx is concerned, that's most clearly demonstrated by the fact that it has no material being. So a being with no material manifestation is just this non-entity. It's just a creation of consciousness. And obviously, as far as he's concerned, is that given that this is a lie, you can undo it, you can reverse it, so you can use any means whatsoever, because the lie is itself so terrible that justifies any means necessary in terms of overturning it. And then in terms of trying to obviously avoid just attribution that my statements on the monad at the end of Marx's system is anything less than a theological entity, there are quotes all the way throughout Marxist literature all about the religious and spiritual nature of their own movement. There's one with Mao where he says the god that they worship is none other than the Chinese people. So you can actually see the idea rendered explicitly in Mao, and in Gramsci you've got very similar ideas. So you obviously need to replace religion as the means through which morality is conveyed, and in terms of organizing society. So you have socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. So it's seen as one religion overcoming another. It's just a different form of religion. This one is materialist. So this is their own conception, their own categories, and how they conceive of themselves. So Sartre, in What is Literature, so this is in 49, he maintains this theological assault against Christianity. It's the common theme. It's one of the things which unites all of the Marxists. It's the hatred of God, the hatred of Christ, and generally to take any one of the values and to invert it. So if you think that the entire world is a deception through the lens of God, then everything communicated and thereby associated with God is the inversion of what it ought to be. So you need to flip it on its head, and that's where you find the truth. Or a kind of sense of the truth, but you're not going to have necessarily an objective truth in the same way as you would under a Christian view of the world. So Sartre sustains the theological warfare. Surrealism will continue to attack the Christian Thomist stage of civilization. So, very consistent with what Gramsci was saying. It's got to be undone, overcome, and replaced with communism as the abolition of private property, atheism as the abolition of God, negative humanism as the abolition of religion, and then these things are replaced ultimately by communal property. So that's communism, and then the collective consciousness and the reformation of human nature. So that's socialism, which can be reformed through socialist labour and so on and so forth. And it's quite clear that he says that it's an attempt at liberation. So again, you've got quite clear religious language. It's liberation from a false form of reality, the alienated form of reality, where we're using either religion or philosophy to understand the world around us. Instead, it needs to be liberation through correctly apprehending the material world around us. And you start to see similar ideas and references to the surrealist developments in France, one by Georges Bataille. So the surrealist object found essentially in aggression, its job being to annihilate or reduce to nothingness. And so that's very important, because if you've read the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, in which Marx states a number of things about criticism being one of the tools of revolutionary philosophy. Criticism is a revolutionary action because it destroys, it tears down, it dialectically reforms the things that it wishes to keep and sustain as part of the revolution. Surrealism is the heir to that same tradition of critique. So whereas original critique in Marxism would show that the things which are philosophical or religious are actually just voids, they're nothing at all, surrealism is now doing the same. It's still motivated by the head of passion, is the way that Marx described it. Here it's now as aggression. Its task is to annihilate or reduce to nothingness. Well, this is the exact same system. So Sartre says, surrealism is entering a period of withdrawal. It is breaking with Marxism and the Communist Party. It wants to demolish the Christian Thomist edifice stone by stone. So again, it's the clear assault on civilization as it's developed and manifested itself after Christianity and Thomism. I'm not entirely sure. I didn't look into what Thomist is, but we see the idea here, which is abundantly clear, that surrealism is mated with Marxism. It's performing a function with Marxism. In fact, what we'll see, what should steadily be clear, at least with the thought of Canguilhem, is the idea of moving beyond Marxism. So it's still using dialectical methodology, historicist tools, and various tenets that are already latent and well developed in Marxism. But since Marx and Engels' original writing between, essentially 1840, 1880, you've got then a series of later developments. For example, there's a chap called Antonio Labriola who in 1895 to 8 is essentially applying the intention-extension argument to Marxist methodology and saying, hey, guys, you're too focused on the economic manifestation. It is important. That's the moral sphere as far as Marx is concerned. But the ideas themselves, dialectical materialism, can be applied to wider areas, and is then immediately almost following that you get Lukács saying that the revolutionary methods of Marx himself had already been basically infected by this alienated religious thought, and so there's a need to go back and revive and redo the whole system, but now conscious of the fact that knowledge can stand as a barrier. Then obviously you have the developments of Gramsci, so this is looking at how things like knowledge, education, people's identity, the way that the proletariat manifests itself as an independent class, it should now actually maintain its position in society, but use the knowledge from each of the, each different role in society that people could possibly be in whilst they're a member of the proletariat, and use that to turn to the revolution. So you have an updating of the Marxist understanding and methodology, but that necessitates that it must move beyond Marxism, orthodox Marxism itself. And so what you see clearly with Labriola and Gramsci, and to some degree Lukács and Marcuse, is one of the initial breaks with orthodox Marxism. That certainly developed in Frankfurt School. And then here we're also seeing something similar in France under Canguilhem. It's the alternative route to materialism by engaging with Descartes' philosophy, and here Sartre is going through literature. But when he's tapping into surrealism, breaking with Marxism, he's really talking about that there's a new way of reviving the methodology itself. There's a different way of associating past religious and philosophical ideas or cultural ideas with something which is a void, so that destroys them, and then it allows them to be dialectically reformed, and then what's going to be injected instead is now kind of more of a subjective sense of meaning, is what's going to come through from Sartre and his engagements. So in what is literature, there's a clear concept of milieu as well. It's like Canguilhem, recognised to impress itself upon the individual, so this is the environment acting on the person now. With intellectual advancements, it's quite clear to recognise that it's not as environmentally deterministic as in Marx's system. In Marx, the epoch in time has a predominant set of ideas. So this is the ideology which sustains the material relations and form of domination. But in manifesting that form of domination, you'll then have contrary ideas which are developed, and it's those which are supposed to, some people come to awareness of this generates the proletariat, and then they can then begin to consciously work themselves into generating the new historicist epoch, which comes with a new people, and so on and so forth, until you get to the end of history in the monad in Marx's system. In Canguilhem and Sartre and some of this area, there's a bit of a movement away from a pure environmental determinism. There's actually means of getting caught up in dialectical eddies and needing to move back and or at least turn them towards the side of the revolution rather than kind of blocking it. And there's new ideas here as well, which are being integrated into Marxist philosophy. So you see people like Nietzsche being bolted in quite heavily now. So that's the individualist aspect coming through, and that's going to, where you've already got the understanding in Marxism that people are primarily collective, expressions of the collective, and the collective is their true identity. There's a rather limited kind of proto-psychology that you have in Marxism. So when you bolt in the Nietzschean developments of the individual psychology and psychological types that you get particularly through the Frankfurt School, then is going to lead to quite a number of changes in terms of the way that the philosophical system is structured and for parsing out people's relationships with other individuals and society around them. So now there's the effect of people acting on their environment, because to some degree people are going to need to labour, they take part, they create the world around them, their environment. That can include the intellectual ideas. These act back on the people and then sustain themselves and prevent the revolution. So obviously now you need to address people at the individual level to get them to take part in the revolution. So one of the things in Sartre is that the writer can exert themselves against the existing milieu. So as far as he's concerned, the role of the poet, the writer, the person who's coming up with fiction is to basically draw them towards being in contradiction with their current political age, climate, and the various ideas and the people around them. And this is to try and lead them towards the revolution. So there's a existing cultural milieu, and you want to try and, obviously, as you do in Marxism, you find the victimhood, you blow it up, you make everything a clear binary between good and evil. Everything associated with the revolutionaries is good, everything not associated with the revolutionaries is evil, and then you progress therefrom. So literature is one kind of milieu, and quote, "In short, actual literature can only realize its full essence in a classless society." So you're kind of seeing these ideas, again, very definitional, that there's only really literature if you've gone through the Marxist process of the revolution and transformation. Until you've actually gone through this dialectical transformation of all of reality and creation, all of being, I should probably say, until you've gone through that and you've basically taken all of the old aspects of reality and then you've dialectically reformed them, so it's that kind of philosopher's stone. It's got some sort of latent true nature trapped within it, but there's this deceit, whether it's belief in God or whatever it happens to be, even the tools and the objects around you, these are all in a kind of a lower form, and they need to be reformed in order to extract the true essence that's hidden within them. So that's that alchemical idea. You've got a lump of lead, and you sublimate out the gold, and here it's the same, but it's taking part through a mental transformation and operation that you're performing on the world around you, and it primarily advances through language, and obviously thereby the person associates their subjective experience and meaning through language with the objects around them, and their moral valency, and then uses this to say, okay, well, the world as it is, because it's not being completely reformed in line with my word and my image and my sense of meaning, it's not its true self. It's lacking some part of its essence. So it's a moral imperative to realize the true nature of all these things, essences, by engaging in the revolutionary process. And you need to destroy the things in order to kind of break them apart, see them, and then reform them, and then you put them back together in their higher form. So a literature of praxis is coming into being in the age of the unfindable public. So the idea there is praxis is a two-component system. So it's got a dual nature, kind of like masculine and feminine, and you've got the theory stage. So you come up with the ideas. That's typically done through criticism. Or surrealism. You'll establish new ideas, new theories. And then critique is also putting it into practice, so doing the actual act of critiquing or destroying something by combining it with surrealism. That's the practical stage that leads to new theories. So you've got this wave of praxis which is always oscillating and moving forward, and which is constantly going through this process of deconstructing the objects and aspects of reality around you in order to then try and sublimate out some aspect of their true nature through this destruction. Obviously, once you apply that to people, it's very clear to see why the proletariat are always doomed to annihilate the people around them and themselves. It's why genocide is actually built in on a structural level when it comes to Marxism and all of Marxist thought. That's why they keep killing people. It's built into the system at a fundamental level. Anyway, let each one handle it in his own way, that is, his own style, his own technique, his own subjects. So the idea of an unfindable public, this is that collective third subject which is standing at the end of history. So it's the union of humanity and nature. There's the living substance, conscious aspect with socialist consciousness standing at the end of it. That's your third subject. It's the people who survive the whole process, who at the very end look back and think, well, there's a hell of a lot of bloodshed, but it was all worth it. Those are the people who are the unfindable public, or one of the people who are referred to as the other in the Marxist system. You've got to be very careful when you're understanding what they're referring to when it comes to the other. When it comes to some of Derrida's discourses, that can refer to the snake in the Garden of Eden. Here it can refer to the monad and the human entity united with nature at the end of history. So everyone's got to handle this process in their own way. So this is quite a clear break from the environmental determinism. It's saying that you've got some sort of degree of agency, you're engaging with it. Once you hear the ideas and you have your own means of implementing it in the world. So what this is going to introduce is really more of the psychological aspect. You can see this thesis developed already between Marcuse and Horkheimer and Adorno at this point. Horkheimer and Adorno had written Dialectical of Enlightenment in 1944. But you're going to see that you're going to need to embody all of the revolutionary ideas of Marx and then integrate them into your own life. And you're going to need to find your own way relative to your location, how to implement this, with the people around you. So his own subjects, that can be the people, like I say, all immediately around you, but then you as an individual. So it's how you need to then sublimate a different form of yourself out of yourself. You need to, and then a transformation of your nature that goes concomitant with this. So part 2 is going to look at the dialectical reason, and Jean-Paul Sartre has got a critique of dialectical reason, and he's going to level a number of challenges back against Marx and Engels, and this is just a demonstration of how you're moving past the original system. So one of the key things is the method of reason itself. So I've been touching a little bit on Horkheimer and Adorno just because they're very useful people to read. Dialectical of Enlightenment, although it's a very hard text, it took some time for me to get familiar with it and to really understand, and I haven't read it recently, so I don't want to say an awful lot about it. But one of the ideas that comes out of the Dialectic of Enlightenment is Horkheimer and Adorno break with the monad that's at the end of Hegel and Marx's system, and what they're trying to do is develop a kind of maneuverability which extracts them from the rigid aspects of Marx's system. So Marx and Engels have got all of their specific ideas, specific dialectical movements. A becomes B, B becomes C, and it's all laid out. There's a pathway for everything, and if you're on this pathway, then theoretically you should end up at the end. Well, the problem was that it didn't actually occur like that, and where the Marxist ideas were implemented, they ended up in murderous violence. Now, Horkheimer and Adorno, they're intellectually extremely dishonest. They then attribute these to the bourgeoisie, so the very people who were supposed to be being overcome through the revolution. It's actually their fault. They infected all of the communist and revolutionary ideas. That's why it went so murderous. They're not forthright in their understanding of their own system to recognize that alchemical principle, once you apply it to people, along with the idea that you need revolutionary violence, is going to lead to genocides and massacres. So they can't really apprehend that the murderous aspect is latent within their own philosophy, and of course that would mean that you wouldn't necessarily need to completely deal with those motives and proclivities within your own character. That's quite important because they take a more psychological aspect, so they really take they take Gramsci's insights, and they're starting to look at how all of the different cultural productions, whether it's music, art, films, and so on and so forth, are used back on the people and to exert power on them and to induce them into doing certain behaviors. They're writing in 1944, studying Nazism. Nazism, of course, finds inspiration in Marx's methodology and ideas. You can find the quotations for that in my book in part 1. So they're kind of studying, ironically, Marxism through a mediating philosophical entity, though that has been mated with some ideas from Nietzsche, as well as some of the more kind of esoteric and occultist philosophers that were in Germany at the time. But one of the things the Dialectic of Enlightenment does is it posits that the form of enlightenment, so this is the form of consciousness itself, essentially has this nefarious germ within it, and it's always kind of eating away. This kind of little chubby grub is always nibbling away and trying to grow and develop into something else. And the thing which is always trying to catch up, as far as they're concerned, with whatever system it is that's implemented, is the problem of totalitarianism. And this leads them to reject any kind of grand constructions of the kind of Hegel or Marx. So you won't necessarily say, okay, well, at the end of history, we now have this monad with this communism, with this form of socialism, and this kind of social organization, and none of these states and borders and so on and so forth. That's going to be all gone. But what they will maintain is that there are known ends for existing systems. So, for example, whatever kind of government or political ideology is prevalent at the time, they will say that it will certainly devolve into totalitarianism. And so when you've got this certainty of totalitarianism for whatever is established or whatever is existent, and you deny the known end of Hegel or Marx's system, what you're left with is essentially constant transformation. So you're always trying to run away from the totalitarianism. And you find that is precisely the core of their philosophy, that, you know, essentially time, a temporal core truth is the way they describe it. So you're always running away from terror, and you're trying to always posit new morals to stay away from this. You don't necessarily know what form the terror is going to take, so you need to always have, you know, infinite tools, or all tools and possibilities to hand for the intellectuals, and they're essentially meant to act as philosophical and spiritual shepherds to take all of humanity through all of this new era of constant transformation. So that's the birth of critical theory. Now, one of the other approaches is that of Sartre, which is saying, okay, well, one of the reasons that you end up with domination and the sustaining of all of the old systems, and part of the reasons why the revolution didn't succeed, was because most of the people weren't actually coming at it from the perspective of dialectical reason itself. And so the critique here is really of Marx and Engels, and essentially of academics in general. It's really an application of Gramsci's ideas, because Gramsci had come up with the idea that all revolutionaries should have access to the intellectual contents and methodology of the movement. So Sartre is just finding another way of parsing this out, and so he turns Gramsci's critique again back against Marx and Engels and saying, well, you guys had access to the dialectical methodology, the historicism, so on and so forth. You came up with this system, and people were supposed to just move into it and become revolutionaries. But when push came to shove, that's not what happened. And the contradiction, because you've got to recall that contradictions are always a problem within this philosophical framework. The contradiction here is position between Marx and Engels and all of the revolutionaries. So what you need to do is collapse the distinction between them. That's what Gramsci does. That's why everyone needs to be an intellectual. And here Jean-Paul Sartre is trying to make that a bit more specific. He's saying, well, the people themselves need to have the dialectical form of reason to hand in order to all be equal revolutionaries in the movement. This is taking some of the insights, more of Gramsci and Lukács, that knowledge itself can be a barrier to the revolution. So if knowledge, scientific ideas, they've got certain contents, they imply certain things and have people, you know, interact with the world in certain ways. If people are still being taught scientific methodology, then they're not going to be looking at the world and interacting with it through the dialectical methodology. So these two things are, as we've seen through whether it's Marx and Engels, they recognize that it's one of the fundamental ways of overcoming the old understanding of reality. That is repeated in Canguilhem, where Canguilhem is rejecting the mechanism and the objectification of the biological world. Here it's essentially the same argument being parsed out, which is it's the dialectical form of reason which needs to overcome the analytical. The reasons why past movements failed, the unity between them, and the revolution didn't manifest itself was because it wasn't correctly using the dialectical methodology. And you can kind of see how he states that praxis outstrips knowledge. And so this is trying to avoid reducing the world to any kind of objective knowledge and truth. It's the fact that all of this is constantly moving. If there's one principle that can be maintained, it's that, you know, change is the principle. And in that guise, even knowledge itself is constantly reformed, and you don't necessarily know what knowledge you're going to need. But the dialectical methodology provides the scientific framework, in other words, structured framework for performing the transformations of knowledge. You have to have praxis. Praxis is the thing which reforms the knowledge. Praxis is obviously going to include the application of dialectical methodology. So Marxism is history becoming conscious of itself. So that's the third subject that's at the end of history. In Marxism, that's the monad, humanity and nature. And then there's a distrust of the established, and this is necessary if a living Marxism is to incorporate into itself the disciplines which have hitherto remained external to it, amounts to requiring Marxists to establish their method a priori. So here you're just seeing, again, the continuation of the same form of reason and the same kind of conclusions, which is Marxist methodology, the dialectical form of reason, historicism, so on and so forth, needs to reform everything in reality, everything in existence, every individual, and it's through that process that the same or a new form of third subject at the end of history can thereby be constituted. But a key part in this is having a praxis of knowledge, so it's recognising how science and philosophy and understanding or habits conveyed through culture are standing in the way, and how these have a bearing on individual psychology. Now, of course, if you're going through this process of the alchemical transformation, you're taking out the hidden essence and then bringing it out. The issue is the scientific methodology and the scientists themselves. So the scientists take information, they have a certain way of reasoning, they exclude certain things, typically the subjective, and they if you're a scientist, you take as a given that there's going to be contradictions between different things. But generally, if there's a theory which is trying to unify them, you're going to defer to experiment, you're going to defer to the material world. Here with dialectical reason, you are to some degree going to integrate the ideas from experiment, so that's the shift from science to scientific ideology, a la Canguilhem. But now you're going to have the two diametrically opposed against one another, so you need to depose the analytical form of reason, so you're going to need to have scientists which are subjectivists. They're going to use the dialectical methodology. And so here the governing thing is that the form of logic itself needs to be subject to the dialectic as its law, the law of being. What's taking place here is that you can use your mind to associate and to bring ideas into union with one another as part of those mental alchemical transformations. So if you cast your mind back to lecture 1 when I had the picture of the wagon wheel, there's the hub in the center, which is the subjects, that would be you or I, and then we reflect in and out of our consciousness ideas. Those ideas are the fellows, which are at the end of the what are they called? Spring spokes. So at the ends of the spokes, and then these are likewise all encased within the tire or a band, whatever you want to call it. And that was to represent that all of the different ideas are reflected in one another. So there is a certain freedom and fluidity that the dialectical methodology gets you to be aware of, because you already hold in your consciousness a kind of metacognitive regulation that you can associate certain ideas with other ideas, and that by bringing these ideas together and teasing out the tensions, what's similar and what's dissimilar between them, you can come to new information. But of course, Hegel's system's called speculative idealism, so this knowledge is speculative. Normally, if you're a scientist, you would then try and test it, and that would tell you whether there's actually anything there or not. It's that second part which is lacking when it comes to the dialectical methodology. So you've certainly got the cognitive aspect where you can associate things with one another, where you can come to developments, you can come up with ideas and theories, but there's that element of testing them which is lacking. And then you see that most explicitly in the idea that rather than Marxism needing to be essentially ditched as a system, the approach is to just reform it. So if we've got the more perfect idea, then it'll work. This is the circular logic. So if you can come up with the perfect idea and then implement it, everything will just run as planned, and that the promised society can be realized. The problem is, of course, is that in that process, you're going to end up killing millions, now with world population, billions of people. But it's that's not sufficient to essentially reject the system, because if you're going to reject the system, then you need to say that suffering is a fact of life. It's going to continue. All you can do is make the best trade-offs available, and that world is actually far more morally complex in terms of the decision making and the kind of tools you're going to need to reason in order to build a stable civilization. So the form of dialectical reason is itself here being reformed, and that's leading to a reform in Marxist ideas and the approach of Marxists. So they're now moving beyond their own system. But nonetheless, he reasserts Marxist monism. So Sartre is distinct from Horkheimer and Adorno. He can still preserve a known endpoint. So Horkheimer and Adorno don't necessarily know where they're going. They just they need to have the intellectual tools to get away from even the ideas that they created previously. Whereas in Sartre, you've still got a known end that you can work towards. But it's just now updated with awareness of knowledge and things like this. So the solution that he has to the two problems that he's essentially attributing to Marx and Engels and critiquing them over is that Marxism itself is a dialectic. Okay, so this is essentially the exact same argument that Labriola had already delivered in opposition to positivism. So positivism is just seen as this immense singular entity. Auguste Comte was very important for the establishment of positivism, but here it's often used to talk about things like analytical reason and science themselves. So Marxism, its dialectical methodology, is in opposition to the scientific method, and for all the reasons we've discussed. So dialectical reason can assert certain totalizing truths, if not the whole truth. So this is the Hegelian aspect coming through. You can reconcile all information and knowledge with itself. So in Hegel, you've got a monad, but that's in the sphere of philosophy. In Marx, you end up with, the embodied monad. And here you've got the same, essentially, understanding of dialectical reason. So you've got totalizing truths and then the whole truth. So you've got these, it's like a fractal conception of existence where you have a whole truth and then you can have subdivisions of truths underneath that. So you could think of like a pyramid of pyramids, and then obviously if you step back far enough, then you can make sense of all of those little pyramids together in a pyramid shape as its own pyramid. So man must be controlled by the dialectic insofar as he creates it, and create it insofar as he's controlled by it. So again, clear example of the circular logic of the system. It's self-referential, so we create the dialectic, but the dialectic controls us. This is the reformation of human consciousness, and then everything else which is derivative, so that needs to be human, as far as they see it, is human nature, the knowledge we create, the culture that we also create, and the laws, things like the morals and so on and so forth. So all of these need to be integrated into the dialectical system and methodology, and this also necessarily means that every single one of them become dialectical, they become processional, they all become infinitely reformable. But further than this, the dialectic is the law of totalization, which creates several collectivities, several societies, and one history, realities, that is, which impose themselves on individuals. So again, we're seeing an important development in terms of the relationship of the individual to the collective, but now more of the world and each of human manifestations are seen as being underpinned by the dialectic. And you've got one history, so he's seeing that, there's an entwinement between human history and natural history, so that's one of the contradictions in the form of historicism. But likewise, you have different collectives, different nations, different societies, civilizations, cultures, knowledge, so on and so forth, different forms of religion. So this is the world existing in contradiction. And the dialectical methodology, you can use reflection and then the principle of the alchemical transformation. So you crash the things together and then you go from two into one and so on and so forth, and you continue doing this process and you bring everything into this more coherent singular unity. So at the end of history, you've got everyone essentially thinking the same thing, using the same methodology, using the same knowledge, having the same human nature, and so on and so forth. So it's incredibly rigid and predictable and boring, because all of life's variety is crushed. So anyway, the dialectic is the thing whereby you can cognitively make all of these associations, and thereby but it's confused with a law. So because you can perform this cognitive operation of association, that it's this law where things have to govern the movement towards this this integrated whole. So no one can discover the dialectic while keeping the point of view of analytical reason. So it's just reiterating the fact that they're completely polar opposites of one another. So naturally, you can see how if you are not in the proletariat, or if you're not after Gramsci in the subaltern classes, then your existence, if you have analytical reason, if you're using the old knowledge and things like this, that is preventing the advance of the dialectic. That's preventing the creation of the third subject and the religious monad that's at the end of Marx's or Sartre's system. So, it's very clear why you either need to join them or you need to be purified. You need to be sent back to the ground. So the dialectic is a product, but whilst it is a product, you embody the dialectic itself. So you conceive of yourself as a dialectical being. This means that on a physical level, as well as a level of your consciousness, there's going to be a dialectical movement and interaction with them. There's going to be a dialectical interaction with your peers around you, and you're all going to be pulling in this direction towards the end of history, the monad. And so you are taking part in this process. It's not completed yet, but you are somewhere on, if you remember in the previous presentation, I had a cone. I should have probably popped it in here, but you've got this cone of history, which is going from the old, advancing towards the new. So you, from your point in wherever you happen to be, you can cast your mind back into history, and then you can associate all of those events and ideas with the present day, and then you can try and link them up with predictions on what they should be in the future. And so this is building that coherence between all of the different levels of the dialectic, all of its manifestations in the different aspects of human existence and reality, and then also charting the connection between them across history, and then how one is always tied to the other. So lived experience of the dialectic, your experience of life is itself dialectical, and obviously where we are creating the dialectic and the dialectic is then creating us, there's this Eurobric aspect. Eurobric would be, circular, but because it's being parsed out across different moments in time, that's the more fractal aspect of it. So at each point, you would be conceiving yourself as a dialectical being, but then you can cognitively locate yourself. So, okay, if I'm in an institution and we're talking about this certain subject, I'm bringing my dialectical perspective to it. Or if I was a scientist in this area, I would have access to this knowledge and I could dialectically reform it, and then that would have a bearing on the type of labour and production that people do over here. That, of course, has moral value in Marx's system and the productive system of the materialists, so you can go through this process of essentially associating all things with all things, and then placing things into contradictions with one another in order to garner certain knowledge or understanding by combining certain ideas. And so what he'd fundamentally like is for the dialectical materialism to be rooted in humans, their experience, their psychology, the things that they come into contact with, and this is going to make it bolted into their sense of meaning and their experience of the world, and this is going to make it far more potent in terms of overcoming analytical reason. So if you centralize the subject in the reformation of the form and content of knowledge, we're saying this is, the speculative knowledge, so it's given a different word, G, because of gnosis, because the idea is that you can actually know something in its totality, and that it's certain, although it's always open to being dialectically reformed. But the point is that individual experience and consciousness is going to become this the linchpin of all of our understanding of the world around us, of all knowledge. And so it becomes a constituent element of our identity, consciousness, emotion, and intuition. And we move from being creatures and beings living in contradiction, to seeing ourselves as needing to affect this totalization in all of the different things which we can have contact with and have experience of, and then within our own lives as a collective, as part of the revolutionaries. So one of the important things that this does is it might not necessarily fully restore the same monism that's at the end of Marx's system, but what it does is certainly has a more open-ended approach to the things that can be created and aimed at. It's going to be far more subjective, it's going to be far more chaotic, it's going to be substantially more varied than Marx's original system, and we can see how each individual is going to bring their own perspective to the revolution. So this is what we really see manifesting itself fully in Sartre, when we've got these Nietzschean ideas and developments of the individual coming through and then being integrated into Marxist dialectical philosophy. And of course, this is going to mean that people themselves are going to need to be fundamentally changed. That comes perfectly from Marxist philosophy, because human nature is infinitely reformable by the collective. Your consciousness is reformed, and you take part in the reformation of consciousness. This changes, the following generations, and it's this continual processional creative destruction of human nature and your mind and the ideas that you have. So when you're in this process, you've obviously got to overcome your natural self, and so you can kind of again see some of the religious aspects of this, where you are self-sacrificing the worst aspects of yourself in order to try and obtain a kind of higher iteration of yourself. Obviously, in religious systems, I suppose in Christianity, you're trying to self-sacrifice the sinful and the bad aspects of your character, and then you move closer to God, and that's essentially one of the important things. But there is a human nature, and it's split by the capacity for evil and the capacity for good. Whereas here, everything is obviously subjectively defined, so good and evil are just whatever you decide to label them, providing they're underpinned by the dialectical methodology and historicism. So that's why you can say that anything which disagrees with you is inherently evil and needs to be destroyed, and this is part of your journey of becoming a higher and better person. So naturally we'll see a rejection of things like common sense, or anything which is essentially kind of naturally occurring, where it's not underpinned by the dialectical methodology. You need to deliberately make them dialectic and overcome them. So now we'll come more directly onto lived experience and how the individual is embodying this dialectic and the praxis. So that's you're doing the actual work to critique and tear down ideas, come to further understanding, and you're actually advancing the dialectic. So your purpose in life is to manifest the development of the dialectic in every aspect of life and reality, and to reform all knowledge, and then to take part in this transformation of humanity, human nature, by transforming ultimately yourself. So lived experience, dialectical reason must be embodied and known, so it's metacognitive. That's important to recognise, that whenever you're dealing with a Marxist, they've got a form of reason which is distinct from your own. So whenever new information or new experiences come in, whenever they have new experiences, they're always going to be using an existing system to bolt it into the way they understand the world. It's fundamentally emotional, takes a subjective perspective. Obviously, it can be very arbitrary when it comes to morals and the labelling of morals, and then obviously when you determine what purpose people have, and then obviously if people are a means to an end, then their moral value is going to be associated with whether they deliver that end or not. So it's all the information that the person is going to be exposed to when they're a Marxist is going to go through this system which is already developed, which has got metacognitive regulation. So it's going to be quite difficult to try and have a typical conversation with them, because they're going to be seeing you as essentially a mouthpiece of alienation, which is trying to drag them back to their lower essence, which is trying to get them to affirm a false reality, which is inherently cruel. That's why there's all suffering. So any kind of utterance you make or argument that you put forward to them is essentially the maintenance of all evil and the greatest form of oppression. So you can't let people speak. So that's again tied into whether you are acting correctly, whether you've got the correct moral value by being in alignment with the dialectical methodology. So of course, this means that subjective and objective being can all be transformed towards this more integrative totality through praxis. We are dealing with a materialist dialectic. So again, that's just paying homage to Marx. That's all that statement's stating. This could be done with Hegelian idealism, and either the dialectic is a dream, or it can be done with the real material world of Marxism. So Sartre is actually toying with what direction should be used in terms of reviving the revolution. He says that the Hegelian form is very close to Marxism, but he's going to opt ultimately for Marxism. That's just confirming what I've already written in my book, The Revolutionary Renaissance, whereas one of the key things is that Marx basically just materializes the substantial body of Hegel's system. Fair enough, he does make some innovations and changes, but if you read Hegel and you understand Hegel, particularly the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, then you actually have the entirety of Marx's system, or at least what will become Marx's system later on. So the dialectic develops new knowledge. This reforms the understanding of the world. The motive force of everything is individual action. So the idea is that this new development of knowledge and the dialectic now needs to be rooted at the individual. And indeed, insofar as the individuals in a given milieu are directly threatened in practico-inert necessity by the impossibility of life, their radical unity is in the inflexible negation of this impossibility. So that word salad is basically just saying that one of the key things for the revolutionaries is to recognize that they exist in a current milieu. Part of that milieu is using the analytical form of reason. It's produced all of these different forms of knowledge. There's a culture and sciences and all these different things associated with it. There's a concept of self that you have which is associated with it. The key thing for the Marxist, subaltern revolutionary to recognize is that they have been destroyed. And that the life as it currently is actually the impossibility of their life. And so the idea which Sartre is cultivating here is that once you recognize that the present mode of existence is actually making a fulfilling life impossible, then the only conclusion left is that you need to radically transform life. So you need to overthrow it. So that's the radical unity in the inflexible negation of this impossibility. So you come together as a collective. Your task is to negate the impossibility of your life. So anything which is non-Marxist, you need to overturn. So the domains of lived experience should be fairly straightforward. There's the bodily aspect, there's your mind and your consciousness, and then there's even the spiritual aspect. You won't see the spiritual aspect develop so much in Sartre, or even the majority of the generation following immediately Canguilhem and Sartre in terms of atheism. They're essentially asserting the same ideas or similar kind of ideas as to those of Marx and Engels, which can be traced all the way back to Feuerbach. But you will have in later on, more among the feminists actually, and among queer theorists, you'll then start to, and Paolo Freire, you'll then start to get the integration of explicit theological ideas back into Marxism. Of course, we know that given that socialism is a religion which is designed to overturn and destroy Christianity, then a theological integration into Marxist philosophy and Marxist methodology is not at this point something outside the realm of reason. And of course, once you've got the dialectic, especially if you're coming at it from the Horkheimer and Adorno school, which is critical theory, you don't know what tools you're going to need to hand. So an integration of theological ideas and a certain sense of spirit into the Marxist movement is conceivable, but it takes a number of years until that actually manifests itself, which it already is presently doing. So, of course, domains for action, anything to do with individual experience. There's just some examples here, but that's, you as an individual, the people around you, institutions that you partake in, information that you receive, and any place where you can, either speak or express yourself, or you have some sort of sensory stimulation. So it's any aspect of life. And of course, the dialectic is trying to take all of this and to kind of tie it in, and bolt it into a singular system. And one of the most important aspects of lived experience, which is important to bear in mind when it comes to understanding dialectical philosophy and specifically the Marxists, is the centrality of victimhood. Victimhood holds moral currency. It's the thing that you claim in order for other members of society to come in and adjudicate on that claim. And at most, a claim of victimhood precedes the ability to have self-defense. So if someone obviously attacks you, you can defend yourself. So victimhood here in the Marxist sense is always claimed, because if you struggle to reveal to yourself your murderous intentions or your continued engagement with a system which has produced multiple genocides, and that you're actually actively reforming this process, you still want to implement it, it's obviously likely to then create further genocides and mass murder, and facilitate, new kinds of Stalins and Maos and Pol Pots and these kind of people, new Hitlers arising. Then, you're going to need to have some sort of severe degree of unconsciousness in order to engage with that. And one of the ways, or one of the manifestations of that, certainly seems to be in the continual attribution of victimhood. So that, on the one hand, absolves the person from any kind of serious self-control or moral decision-making or understanding the complexities of life. You can reduce everything down to the single moral dimension of victimhood, and then use that to force every political transformation that you desire onto society. And when it comes to life and suffering in general, you take any manifestation of victimhood in any dimension, and what you try and do is you then dialectically reform it. So obviously any example where a Marxist has experienced some aspect of victimhood in life, it could be absolutely trivial, but the idea is that all of these can be bolted in to serve the revolution. So they can be used, blame can falsely be attributed to a person where there is none. That's a common one. Or you can find people who are victims, and then you can again use that false attribution of the cause of that victimhood, and then you can, through teaching the dialectical methodology and lived experience, you can then gain those people as followers for the Marxist revolution. So, of course, victimhood, it attacks a person's social position, it de-emphasizes their positive traits, it allows you to claim offense and harm, but it's an offensive strategy, and I don't think it should be too surprising that, there's different levels of moral complexity. One of the higher ones is recognizing how deceivers and people who are evil can use good to serve evil. So, it's, for example, if you didn't have very much money, and then, you normally gave to charity, and then you stopped giving, for a couple of weeks or whatever it was, because you needed to save money and preserve yourself, that person might come up and say, oh, why aren't you giving money to charity anymore? Are you not as kind a person? And they try and use your kindness or your charity or your virtues against you. So that's something you'll often see with this kind of thought. So in summary, we've got Sartre essentially recapitulating a lot of the methodology and logic which we already saw in Marx and Engels, and which we've also seen recapitulated in a sense with Canguilhem. It's the rejection of the law of identities. So that's up here, the picture, subject object come back together. That can be read through all ideas and all aspects of life. He rejects the dialectic of nature. Ultimately, rejects Marxist monism, or at least Marx's form of monism. It doesn't necessarily mean that a monism can't be reconstituted at the end, but it's going to take a lot more work, and with all of the individual aspect, it just means that on a certain level there can still be a monistic end point, but you're going to have greater importance attributed to the individual. So there's going to need to be further development on working out what the contradiction between those is and how they would be resolved. It is clearly a development of Marxist dialectical methodology. He's clearly historicist as well, and it's definitely materialist, so there's nothing new there. The dialectic and lived experience are in time with one another. So all of your experiences, these can all be made to feed and serve the revolution, and it also provides examples of everything which needs to be dialectically reformed. So you create all of these contradictions. You can do that actively by critique, but at the same time you do this in order to synthesize new totalities, new dialectical unities, and you do that for every aspect of life, and then everyone's taking part in this. So you're going to expect to see an immense fragmentary kind of aspect as people start to dialectically reform different aspects of life from their own unique position as an individual. But you can still conceptualize that as all of those people act as essentially a single collective, which is in opposition to the other one. So there's still a level of analysis in which the dialectical mass, if you can just call them that, are still going to be using the same tools and attacking the same society, although you're likely to see fracturing among those groups of the revolutionaries as they apply their ideas to different areas. So, for example, if you come to critical race theory, that's looking at a racial group as a revolutionary group. So they're one of the types of subaltern. And if you pitched a racial subaltern against a Marxist economic subaltern, proletariat rather, they're obviously going to be in contradiction with one another, because if you're under the Marxist system, you would be in the proletariat regardless of whatever your skin color. Whereas in the critical race theory, you can only be in the racial proletariat if you're of a certain skin color. Of course, white people stand as the bourgeoisie in that system. So the two are different and mutually exclusive. That can just mean that there needs to be a period of revolutionary hashing things out and discerning who needs to die in what quantity, before you can obviously evolve the contradictions, because remember, with the actual form of logic itself, it's oriented towards the cessation of the contradictions. So even if you're looking at these people and their developments and they aren't positing that there is a monism at the end of history, ultimately there is going to be a removal of contradictions, a steady process of unification across the transfer of time, and it's going to move eventually towards the reconstitution of some sort of monist endpoint. If you happen to be in a post-structuralist stage, then you're just in one of the ones where you're breaking apart everything that exists, and then through this creative destruction, that can go through several sequences of reconstitute and then deconstruct, reconstitute and then deconstruct, and you destroy and level things out consecutively. But that doesn't mean that at no point in the future can a form of monism be reconstituted at the end point. Is if you're of the view that you don't know what you necessarily need to destroy until everyone's basically on the same level, then that process can obviously engage multiple times, but it's still built into the form of reason at a fundamental level that they're looking to constitute different totalities. So, it's just a matter of waiting for when and what form and how that certain totality arises. If you go over to, again, the feminists and the eco-feminists, you can start to see the emergence of a kind of a holistic climate Gaian kind of aspect emerging. Or if you go to queer theory, there is a book called Queer Theology, which is about queering God, and bringing forth these kind of ideas. So you do start to see now more integrative systems popping up, but they're just typically an idea, in different areas, whether it's eco-holism or whether it's divinity within your arbitrarily created notion of sexual identity. Here, when we're talking about the stage of like Canguilhem and Sartre and others, those ideas aren't really developed yet, but they are latent within the system. These various systems raise their possibility. So in summary, there's a critique of Marx and Engels' original system, but we can see in certain respects that the critique is essentially recapitulating some of the arguments already made by Marx and Engels themselves. There are distinctions. I think that the real innovation made by Sartre is bolting in the individual aspect and then coming up with lived experience. And you can kind of see this complemented in Georges Bataille's thought. So the idea of, I know I used it in the last lecture, but you've got on the image of Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, there's the image of the Leviathan, which is the king, which is, it's a recognizable entity, it's got features, but you look closely at the body and it's constituted of many different people. So all the different individuals in the state make up, they're part of the Leviathan's body is the metaphor, and that's a very common image when you have Marxists talking about the organs of the state being these various institutions and the party being the head. So it's the same kind of metaphor. But you see that recapitulated in Georges Bataille, where you as an individual must embody within your psyche the collective. And so this is the idea that on a psychological level you're meant to collectivize yourself, and obviously that bolts quite nicely into Sartre's ideas on the dialectic. So it's the integration of the individual aspect and the recognition of the barrier of the individual aspect to the revolution that's the important part. And we'll really see these ideas spiral out quite spectacularly when we come to figures like Derrida and Foucault, who we will touch on later on. But we're going to need to now shift more directly from the some of the Marxist philosophy aspects to more of the environmental application of some of these ideas, and then their manifestation over time in different institutions. So these are the works cited in this episode. Thank you.